let's start with what has often been perceived as a prequel to the Trumpist moment, which is the emergence of the paléoconservative movement or sensibility in the late 80s and turn of the 90s. So the question I would like to ask is about that moment itself. Also, at some point, if you could insert in it its sort of renegade left element, based on the review Telos that started on the left and that moved to the far right and that informed this paléoconservative, just like Trotskyites elements informed the neoconservative. Second, the enmity between the paléoconservative and the neoconservative and how the paléoconservative constructed themselves against the neoconservative, and how this sentiment, this enduring sentiment of anti-neoconservative sentiment, or specifically paléoconservative sentiment, re-emerges with Trump 1.0 and then with Trump 2.0, with an element which maybe you could start with is, because you say it at some point, that the failure of the paléoconservatives when they emerged, their failure to win, has proved instrumental in their second coming through Trumpism.
Okay, great. I think, one of the things I think is generally the case is that we ought to always, we should be kind of chronicling politics and observing them in their failures as much as in their successes, because it's always the case that any successful political movement you see of any kind rests on prior failures. Political actors try things, they don't work, they partially work, they recombine different elements, they try again, different kind of discursive interventions or different kinds of coalitions they try to build. And I think that that's, there's so many things today, I think, that we can look back on it and see where failures began to set the terms for later successes. I think that, the thing about the Buchanan campaign, I think to go to that moment, it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was no longer a kind of a cohesive glue holding the American two-party system together in the same way. The same kind of like liberal democratic belief in a kind of an anti-totalitarianism. It starts with anti-Nazism just after the war, and then anti-Soviet totalitarianism also in that period, is what really kind of held, put boundaries on both the left and the right in American politics across the long post-war era until you get to the 1990s. Aziz Rana makes the legal theorist Aziz Rana, who's at Cornell University, makes this point really well, that that with the end of the Cold War, suddenly the horizons are open for new kinds of politics. And one of the things you see with Buchanan, he ran. So Pat Buchanan he had been a newspaper reporter in St. Louis as a young man before he was recruited to Richard Nixon's 68 campaign as a speechwriter. He was also a speechwriter for Spiro Agnew, who was Nixon's first vice president and always had a much more pugnacious, kind of like often openly racist, combative way of speaking. Nixon could hold off and not, as a presidential candidate in that time period, could not be as openly bare-teethed as a vice presidential candidate could. Spiro Agnew was that person, and it was Pat Buchanan who wrote all his speeches. Buchanan was the son of conservative Catholics. His father was an enormous admirer of Franco, and some of this kind of like deeply hierarchical conservative Catholic conservatism comes through in Buchanan's own work. At that time, Catholics in the United States generally were, a constituent part of the Democratic coalition, and generally progressive on a number of issues. So he kind of is a little bit of an outlier there. But he, across the 70s, continues to indulge his kind of more, kind of populist right-wing visions of either a new party formation. He's part of a group of kind of renegade Republicans who tried to run a third-party effort in the mid-1970s, running George Wallace, they hoped, as a third-party candidate in '76. They hoped to actually have a Reagan Wallace ticket, which didn't come to pass. But Buchanan was always pushing the boundaries of against kind of an old school conservative republicanism. He wanted kind of a more bare-knuckled populist right-wing politics. He was a syndicated columnist in the '70s. Then he became Reagan's communications director, and again was on Reagan's very right flank, and was embattled with neocons in the Reagan administration, and felt betrayed. Felt the conservative revolution had been betrayed by these neocons, and so he by the end of Reagan's second term, he leaves feeling very disappointed in the possibilities of the party. And he considers running in 1988 as a third-party candidate, or first maybe as a Republican candidate for president, and then maybe as a third-party candidate. He decides not to do that. And then, over the next 4 years, a number of things begin to happen in American politics that open up the possibility. George H.W. Bush won the presidency in '88 in part by running a super racist campaign, using the famous Willie Horton ad, for instance. And then there was kind of a renaissance of a kind of more open racism in the post-civil rights era in the U.S. generally. So by 1990, Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon David Duke run for the state legislature, and won a seat in the state legislature in Louisiana, and then he ran for governor after that, and almost won in 1991 as a Republican candidate, for governor in Louisiana. Buchanan thinks this is. What he says, think about the way we should deal with Duke is to find all the issues that are the same ones that conservatives have, Republicans have, and build on those. He said, we don't just need to reject Duke. Find out where there's possible overlap and use that overlap to build a robust politics out of. And then he decides to run himself in '92. He has kind of a small group of advisors around him. One of them was Sam Francis. Francis was kind of a Gramscian organic intellectual of the right. He was an historian trained at University of North Carolina, who had had a job at the Heritage Foundation, and then was editor of the Washington Times, a conservative newspaper, and was an award-winning editor and a really terrific writer and a sharp analyst of politics. He was fired from the Washington Times he was also a white supremacist and just couldn't hold back his racist vitriol often. So Francis was, he was, in his own description, a Caesarist. He thought what American politics needed was a very powerful executive, a very powerful presidential model that could be a battering ram against the administrative state, that could coalesce the energies of kind of an angry middle America, people who were alienated by the professional managerial class, people who were alienated by what was going on in Hollywood and in higher education. And he was ultimately an opponent of democracy. He was one of Buchanan's advisors. The other one was a guy named Joe Sobran, who had been an editor at National Review magazine, who was fired for his, similar to Francis, in his case, he was fired for his inability to hold back his anti-Semitism. So these were the people around Buchanan, kind of his kind of brain trust as he ran in '92. And what they hoped to do was build out kind of this alienated white populist coalition that they had dreamed of also, or that Buchanan had in the mid-70s, dreamed of that as being, there's another story here, which is this is the political tradition that begins with the silent majority that Nixon hopes to build in 68 and 72. Which is a great political story in and of itself. But so Buchanan runs partly in this moment where he sees there's an availability to start talking about things on the right that were not possible during the Cold War era. And he begins to kind of push, celebrating, neo-Nazi leaders in South Africa, for instance, or kind of making kind of openly anti-Semitic, comments about one person or another. He has people around him who are connected to white supremacist organizations. He himself comes very close to making white supremacists and anti-Semitic comments all the time, and he thinks that he can build up a. He makes appeals to the labor movement. He makes appeals to unions. He wants to bring manufacturing back. He really, he has this kind of old American isolationist America First politics, which really ran entirely counter to the whole Republican establishment at the time. No Republican wanted anything to do with him. He had to build this movement, this coalition, really out of grassroots activists and people on the far right. It was not something that neocons were willing to tolerate. But nevertheless, he does a good enough job to get a primetime speaking spot in the 1992 Republican convention, where he gives his famous culture war speech. And it's an electrifying speech to the assembled delegates. And he was not going to make it to the promised land himself, but he had, made his presence known as a tendency in the right that was not going to go away.
Mm-hmm. And just like Moses, the fact that he didn't get to the promised land explains why you eventually get to the promised land.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. Canaan's finally going to be, populated by these people. And so this is, there's a lot to be said about both Buchanan runs again in 1996 with less support. He does well in New Hampshire, does well in South Carolina, but that's pretty much it for him. He runs again in 2000 as a Reform Party candidate. And his opponent directly to his left is Donald Trump in that election cycle. Trump is calling him a Nazi and a Klansman, and it's kind of an interesting different moment. But in that early '90s moment, I think the writer John Gantz captures a lot of this in his book When the Clock Broke, that came out last year. But there is one thing about the early '90s, I think, is that, and I think this is not really discussed enough, is that there was a renaissance of American racism in that moment. It's kind of like the American Civil Rights Movement, the long Black liberation struggle had kind of run out of gas by then. There were very few. The movements have been crushed and destroyed by the FBI and by other forces and by general exhaustion. And it was possible to really begin to more openly embrace kind of racially oriented politics. And it's across the spectrum, right? When Bill Clinton runs in 1992, there's too much to talk about here, but he goes on for, there's racial components to his campaign everywhere. When the bell curve comes out, the Herrnstein and Charles Murray book, 800-page, book about the genetic. Genetic hierarchy that, when that book comes out, it's kind of an old eugenics tome, but the New York Times praises it as saying, well, finally someone's willing to speak openly about this. The racist kind of journal gathering point, American Renaissance begins to have, it's a eugenics, white supremacist organization that begins to have influence. It brings together people like Sam Francis and some of these other old National Review people like John Darbyshire and other people. And those people all influence Buchanan's campaign. So there's something there, there's this flourishing of white racism in this moment, and it's everywhere to be seen, and it's what gives us the idea of a crack baby, which is a mythical character, or the super predator, another mythical character. Here's Rogan's counter-subversion, the production of these monsters that white liberals embrace all over the place as well. So, Buchanan is kind of this spearhead. This is also after the LA riots in '92. There's so much going on in terms of a racially charged animus there that Buchanan is only the right-wing end of, or a spearhead of. It's everywhere else in American culture. And I think that helps explain a lot of where we end up with. The telos part, just briefly, is that telos was a curious critical theory, kind of a Marcusean critical theory journal that began and it's begun by 68ers, like new left elements who really wanted to. It was kind of an anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist, critical theory-oriented journal, which brought together an extraordinary array of great thinkers from the early and mid-'70s, I think, from kind of Western Marxists to anarchists to kind of Frankfurt School-oriented thinkers. By the time you get to the early '90s, Paul Piccone, the editor of the journal, has decided that, based on Herbert Marcuse's one-dimensionality thesis, that there's no possibility in American society, there's no way in capitalist society to generate new forms of resistance, that everything is immediately absorbed and sold back as a form of consumerism, and that there's, it's kind of a version of Adorno's administrative state with capitalism, and there's no way out. And so they begin to look for other possible spaces where you actually have forms of organic society outside of capitalist influence or capitalist control. And they start looking to the French New Right, with Alain de Benoit, for instance, who's talking about a multiculturalism and a form of cultural difference, which is a racial taxonomy, an ethnic taxonomy of groups who can, who once brought together can only be brought together through corporate capitalists, culture. So partly they look to the French New Right, partly they look to Carl Schmitt, partly they look to the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, partly they look to American populism, and they begin through this kind of Schmittian populist vision, begin to articulate a far-right politics. I was in Paul Piccone's office one time. He used to be down on 12th Street here in the East Village, and he had an American flag on the wall and a Pat Buchanan sticker, also on the wall. And it was like this was Telos, the great, and then he also, on the other hand, there was a manuscript on his desk that I asked him what it was that they were working on. He said it was an unpublished or untranslated manuscript by Gustav Landauer, the great German anarchist that they were in the process of turning into a series of articles for Telos. And so they, this was the kind of eclectic scene that Telos was, always kind of open in kind of an earnest way to really any direction that might seem appealing as a form of anchoring in anti-capitalism, but ultimately there was the far right had a stronger appeal to them than many other directions, and this is partly Christopher Lasch was very influential at that time on the culture of narcissism and The True and Only Heaven were both nodal points for Telos at the time, for calling for kind of a retreat to the patriarchal family as a way of resisting, of building up the ego and resisting capitalist culture. And there's many layers to this, but there was a Telos conference in 1992 maybe, where I saw Sam Francis speak and argue for populism to the assembled Telos editors and other people in the room, and where he argued that if they were really serious about this, they had to embrace all kinds of populist revolt. And the example he used was the anti-Semitic riots in London in 1947. You know, and he was doing it to be provocative, but nobody in the room had an answer for him, and so it was kind of a strange moment. I think that was partly a moment where Telos was. Some people like Richard Wolin and other people on the left were kind of leaving Telos at that time. Others stuck around and continued this role until Piccone died a few years ago.